Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. This is Comprehensivist Wednesday, and I'm delighted to have Maritza back on this particular series that she's doing. She picks three thinkers and compares them along one theme. Today, she has chosen Nietzsche, Jung, and Julian Jaynes. Okay, each of these is a giant. We have done tons of meetups. We've done 30 meetups on Julian Jaynes, 45 meetups on Jung, about 10 meetups on Nietzsche. And in one single meetup, we are going to see what they have to, how their views of evolution of consciousness compare. Okay, so it's incredibly complex thing to do, but we are, we will make some progress today. Okay, so the format is Maritza is going to make an introductory presentation. She has chosen one idea each, one most recognizable idea each from each of these thinkers, and she's going to put them, describe them, compare them, and put it on the table. That's step number one. Step number two, we are going to go through these thinkers one by one. Nietzsche first, then Jung, then Julian Jaynes. And we're going to ask, what do you think does Nietzsche have to say about evolution of consciousness? Same for Jung, same for Julian Jaynes. And then we are going to say what is similar and what is different. All right. So you don't have to comment on each of the thinkers, but whatever you know, whichever thinker you're familiar with, please go ahead and contribute. And then let's have a deep discussion. And let's see how we can approach this amazingly difficult topic. All right. With that, over to you, Maritza.
Hi. So my first disclaimer for you all is that I am not an expert in any of these thinkers. I am just kind of a new learner. And so I'm sharing my thoughts here with you today in a very rudimentary spreadsheet. So here, this first sentence is kind of what started me on wanting to compare these.
Can you expand it a little bit? Can you increase the font or so it is easier for people to read? Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So we're looking, I could have made it bigger, sorry. So all three of them, to my mind, they're all looking at what, as Shrikant was saying, they're asking about nature and the drivers of human consciousness and behavior. So the evolutionary process. So I took the three concepts of Übermensch, God voices, and you can't see it here, sorry, and archetypes to look as the most well-known concepts for each one of these philosophers. And I gave just a very quick little origin, concept, and purpose for each one here. And the Übermensch often is talking about it's an idealized individual. He's overcome societal norms, moralities, and traditional values to focus more on their own internal value system. And this concept is that it's transcending beyond conventional limitations of human and giving you a meaning that's outside of just the societal cohesiveness. For Jaynes's God voices, he's talking about how consciousness literally evolved. We were not introspectively conscious as we are now. So he called them auditory hallucinations. And he even gave them a physicality in the brain, like the right hemisphere versus the left hemisphere. And he was looking at this as a concrete stage of evolution for human consciousness. And of the three of them, he's the one that brings it into physicality. And what he's saying is that as societies grow more complex, there's need for introspective consciousness. There's an increased need. And then this leads to the decline of the bicameral mind. Jung's archetypes they're symbols. So they're not literal, like, right brain, left brain, as Jaynes intonates for his bicameral mind. And he's calling them, they're shared motifs and patterns, and they recur throughout time, throughout cultures, and we see them across a variety of myths, dreams, and stories. Uh, and what he's saying is that their purpose in our world is to help us understand the world and our place in it. And, he has many different characters. He has the hero, the mother, the shadow. And these are all bridges to help us understand shared human experiences and also the collective psyche. So those are the three concepts. I have some similarities identified, and the three, the big words are all three of them have they're looking at depth of the mind, historical evolution of consciousness, and some transcendental element of individual transformation. Um, all of them are exploring the dimensions of the mind beyond conscious awareness. Um, they're also all three of them looking at how consciousness evolved. And then there's the idea of which elements are the guiding influence for us as we evolve in our consciousness and our human behavior. So those are the three similarities looking at these three concepts. Some differences that I did identify here are that's the Julian Jaynes's bicameral mind theory suggests a divided brain hemisphere. Like I was saying, he literally talks about right brain, left brain. Jung is looking at shared symbols, myths, archetypes. Nietzsche doesn't have an actual structural model, but he is focusing on cultural and value shifts. So even though his is not tangible, it's all three of them are looking at shifts just in slightly different ways. Um, from and I put here religious angle in consideration as a question mark because they're both using religion as a pivotal point for evolutionary marker, but they're doing so in very, very different ways. So, Jaynes is talking about religious experiences and voices of gods as being manifestations of the bicameral mind. Nietzsche is considering that, the concept of God is dead, and he's critical of traditional religion because he's looking at, individualized thinking and value holding. Jung is looking at religious symbols and rituals as manifestations of our collective unconsciousness. So he's seeing them as, paths towards an integrated consciousness. For in the nature of transformation, Jaynes' transformation from bicameralism to consciousness is, he's looking at it from historical and cognitive perspective. Nietzsche is looking at overcoming social norms, and Jung is looking at the individual process of integration within oneself. So taking just another look at, similarities along a similar topic, I have looked at the bicameral mind versus the collective unconscious and subconscious drives. So Julian Jaynes is looking at um, the ancient humans had divided cognition, and that's what he's calling the bicameral mind. So there was a speaking hemisphere, a listening hemisphere, and this was not based on symbols, archetypes. He viewed this as a more very concrete thing. Jung's collective unconscious is all the symbols, the myths, the archetypes. It's like a reservoir altogether, and it spans across all humanity. There's no division here in the brain, and it's not a historical shift. It's patterns within that are influencing behaviors differently throughout history. For Nietzsche, when I say subconscious drives, I'm thinking of his concept of will to power. And, in with that drive, he's emphasizing that um, there's underlying forces and motivations shaping our human behavior, our values. And again, this is more individual, and it's not about archetypes or specific structures, as would be Jaynes or Jung. With those differences identified, there still can be found within that some similarities here. So looking again, and I'm looking at the same like three concepts just in slightly different ways each time. That's why you keep seeing me going a little bit differences, a little bit of similarities. Hopefully, I'm hoping that makes sense to you as we're going through here. So all three concepts are looking at the human mind. They're looking at behaviors that are operating beneath our immediate conscious awareness. Jaynes's bicameral mind is positing that there's voices guiding behavior. Jung's collective unconscious is working through that with symbols, archetypes that are shared. And Nietzsche's will to power is an underlying drive that's shaping human behavior. All three of them are addressing evolution of human consciousness and behavior throughout time. Jaynes believed that the bicameral mind was a stage in human cognitive evolution. Jung viewed the collective unconscious as a repository of human experiences and symbols that were accumulated. And Nietzsche he wasn't directly evolutionary, but the will to power is considered across various historical contexts and across cultural shifts that happen at different historical points. So all three of these also offer an explanation as to why we humans behave the way that we do. The God voices influenced our actions. The archetypes push us towards certain behaviors or experiences, and the will to power is a drive that motivates our actions. And then there's a tension that is found that all three of them are engaging, and it's the tension between the individual and the collective experiences. Jaynes's bicameral voices are shaped by societal structured and shared beliefs. Jung's collective unconsciousness is also a shared symbology among humans even though it plays out in the individual psyche. And Nietzsche's will to power, it's an individual drive, but it profoundly shapes and is shaped by societal structures and values. And all three of them are addressing this potential for transformation and transformation that has already happened. They're offering us a way to view human transformation. The shift from bicameral mind to consciousness is a form of cognitive evolution. And so in a similar way, Jung believed that by engaging with and integrating the contents of the collective unconscious, we individuals would then achieve individuation or personal transformation. And Nietzsche's will to power is looking at the creation of new values and modes of existence. And he exemplifies that in his idea of the Übermensch, because the Übermensch is somebody transcending the base societal norms. And so I just had two more little points and then I'm done with my synopsis. So all three of them are touching upon human experience, its depth, and its progression. They're giving us insights about how we humans perceive the world, how we perceive each other, and then the forces that are guiding us, either externally or externally. And so that's where I'm going to leave it there, Shrikant.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Okay, now what we're going to do is, Maritza has chosen three concepts. Now I want to widen the field. I want to look at each of these people individually. These are all giants. These are all giants. Okay. And we're going to focus on only one aspect of it. What is the evolution? What do they say about evolution of consciousness? I'm going to start with Nietzsche. I will start with some comments, and then I'm going to invite anybody who wants to add to their thoughts on Nietzsche. We are not doing any comparison at this point. You're saying, what does Nietzsche have to say about evolution of consciousness? Best place, the best capturing of his view of evolution of consciousness is in Zarathustra, where he looks at the 4 stages. He calls it man, camel, lion, and child. I'll modify it slightly, and I'm going to use this as a framework for doing this entire comparison between all these 3. Man, I'm going to call it tribal man. This is like before civilization in the tribe. Then camel is kind of beginning of civilization, where most people couldn't really do things on their own, and they just kind of followed orders, followed all the values, all the ideas that somebody else gave them. So that's the camel. Then there is the lion. I'm going to make it a little bit interesting. I'm going to call it lion and lost sheep. Okay, so the sheep and lions at the same time. There is that phase. And then there is the phase of the child. Okay, so to put it very quickly, I will put the archetypes of Jung mostly in the tribal man. He's actually capturing patterns which are far deeper than civilization itself, about the nature of human consciousness itself, even before civilization. They do show up in civilization, but the core of it starts earlier than that. Nietzsche's, Jaynes' idea of bicameral mind is in the camel phase. Bicameral is the camel where you're just listening to the God and you're doing things in response to that. So that's very much of the camel stage. The Übermensch is mostly in the lion stage, which says no to the current camels and is trying to do something more, hopefully puts a little bit of foot in the child area. So that is the line that I'm putting forth here. So 4 stages. You can look at it as a timeline. I strongly recommend using pen and paper. It's easy to follow. You can just put, tribal man on, just draw a line, timeline, tribal man, camel, lion, and child. So that's how I think Nietzsche thinks, and that's a very good framework to start off with, I think. But would love to hear anybody else who's familiar with Nietzsche to talk about what does he have to say about evolution of consciousness. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to comment on Nietzsche's view of evolution of consciousness. You don't have to go with anything that I have said or Marisa has said. Just look at what you know about Nietzsche and talk about what did he say? What do you think he said about evolution of consciousness? All right, anybody? Folks, let's get started. Let's see here. So Nietzsche on evolution of consciousness. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. We'd like to hear from many people because it's a conversation. We are trying to learn from each other. So we're going to start with DLJ. DLJ, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm only sort of chipping in because everybody's quiet at the moment. In the gay science, or I guess that would be LGBTQ science now, wouldn't it? But in that one, he's quite focused on the idea that he's talking about self-consciousness, in other words, being conscious of oneself. And he's linking it to, very strongly linking it to communication. So the rise of being able to communicate with each other. Have I just frozen? No, all right. The link between communication and then, so therefore the ability to represent ideas, as Maritza said, it's a individual and collective interaction. So it's very strong on that. But 354 is the section on, is it 354, 358, something like that, is one of the key passages where he talks about consciousness.
Thank you, DLJ. Next up is Dave. Dave, go ahead. Folks, don't be shy. Go ahead and type exclamation mark to put your thoughts on the table. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, Shrikant, and I will admit it's been a while since I read Nietzsche, but I take a little different take on the camel. To me, it was a domestication of an animal, because I think up until that point, man thought he was on his own. And when he learned how to domesticate the camel, for example, then he found out he could put cargo on the camel and cross the desert safely. And that expanded his consciousness greatly to realize what his capabilities were and how he could use animals and then, eventually plants and this, that, and the other to improve his civilization. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good point about the nature of camels themselves. And what Nietzsche is saying is that basically people learned to make men into camels who could actually bear, instead of being in the wild like monkey primates doing their stuff in the tribal context. Now in the civilization, think of it as Egypt, and think of it, all the slaves, moving all those things for the pyramids. They're bearing a great amount of weight, and they're doing a lot of work as directed by somebody higher up. And they're not really questioning what they are doing and why they're doing it. And they're doing it in a mechanical manner. It is a tremendous, it is by their action that these civilizations are kept alive. So there is a tremendous value to people doing that. But it also has that kind of bicameral mentality where they are not self-conscious. They are not asking, what should I do? They are taking orders. They are looking to hear voices from their kings, their gods, their supervisors in order to do something. So thank you very much, Dave. Next up is Andy, followed by Maritza. Andy.
Hey, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I hope everyone else feels like me in that maybe a little intimidated to speak of Nietzsche's views so broadly, but I think, it's certainly interesting for me that at the center of Nietzsche's kind of Übermensch project is this idea of the transvaluation of all values. And so it seems that for Nietzsche, like, consciousness somehow is intertwined with morality in a way. And the development of consciousness, I think Nietzsche perhaps relates that to the development of new values and ultimately overturning old conventions and stale morality. And ultimately, I think he thinks the peak of that is his amorality, which seems to be concomitant with a new kind of consciousness. Anyway, just like what else?
Excellent point, Andy. So firstly, I share with you the trepidation of talking about Nietzsche or Jung or Jaynes in this manner, because of necessity, we have to be very short in order to do the comparison. Your point about values and morality is completely on the point, because what the lion does is to say no to the values of the camels. And they're saying it's basically, and Nietzsche in some ways is a lion, is fundamentally a lion more than anything else. He's saying no to a whole bunch of things that have accumulated in society at that time. And it's just a very large no, with a little bit of child growing up. There isn't much camel in him. There is mostly this, and I think there is a lot of tribal man in him, but that's another story. But in terms of the other point that DLJ was making was about self-consciousness, which is also very much connected with it, because camel is not self-conscious. A lion becomes self-conscious, and then says no to what is there. And the child then uses the self-consciousness to build his own values. So there is a progression of values and self-consciousness that Nietzsche talks about. Thank you. Thank you so much. Next up is Maritza.
I'm gonna repeat, not an expert here in any of this. You know, I love that you brought these three in, because they are like the best way to show that transformation. I mean, and I think that you see it repeated in slightly different ways throughout all of Nietzsche's work, the camel, the lion, the child. I think I find for me, the camel is like so pivotal, because it's like it's the beginning. So you can't have transformation without a beginning. And I think oftentimes, and in many of Nietzsche's things, concepts are viewed negatively. I don't believe that. So I think it's like vital to understand that the camel is not supposed to be portrayed negatively. You know, it's a stage that's necessary. It's necessary to overcome, actually, but its qualities of, you know, endurance, responsibility, and dutifulness are acknowledged. They're necessary. They're the starting point for an individual's journey into self-discovery and into transformation. Like, so transformation starts with that endurance and that responsibility. So I really like to defend the camel a little bit, because like the poor camel kind of also always gets kind of vilified a little bit when you know, considering them, because, you know, who doesn't want to go on to lying or the child? There's so much fancier, right? But I think that you can't have lion without camel, and you can certainly never get the child without first being the camel. And that's something I think that we're going to see, hopefully, be able to see the threads among the others as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. So I'll add one thing. Firstly, I would say camel is not the beginning. Camel is the beginning and is not the beginning. Camel is the beginning of civilization, but there is something that is older than that, and that is the tribal man. You know, us living in a evolutionary context.
Of these three, I meant of these three.
Yes. So I think the four is a very good way of seeing it, because all these people go down to all the four. So, for example, lots of Jung's archetypes are rooted in the first, the tribal existence, our evolutionary heritage of evolving in a social context. So that's why I always think of it as four instead of three. So that's one point. Second point is that you're absolutely right that the beginning of civilization, when most people cannot read and write, only few people can. There is a lot of people who are camels, who are so that's one part of it. The other part of it also, you have to look at the value of that in even a more advanced society, that there is a period where you learn everything about your art, about your skill, about your profession, about how the world is put together. And there you are mostly absorbing things, and you're trying to learn what is it. And only after you've mastered that, you are in a position to innovate on that. So this is another beautiful thing about this, is that it's not just ages across history, but within life of each person, you have these things progressing. And in some ways, all four exist in each person at all times, in different fields, in different dimensions for each of us. So it's a very, very powerful sequence which can be applied in multiple ways. So thank you so much, Maritza. Next up is Bill. Bill.
Thanks. I want to point out what seems to me to be a similarity between Jaynes and Nietzsche. I'm willing to bet that the following three assumptions about the human mind's problem-solving abilities are in the literature somewhere, that these assumptions are not original with me. Okay, assumption one is that the human brain does have problem-solving abilities, structures, and capacities. Assumption 2 is that not all of these problem-solving structures in the human mind are in the conscious part of the mind. At least some of these structures are in the unconscious part of the mind. And assumption 3 is that when these problem-solving structures come up with solutions, the solutions are usually not perfectly optimal solutions. They're imperfect and suboptimal in some way. Either they solve the problem partially but not completely, or they solve the problem completely but generate negative side effects that generate other problems. Okay, so with that as a basis, there seems to me to be the following similarity between Jaynes and Nietzsche, which is that things evolve to overcome the imperfections and suboptimalities of the human brain's problem-solving capacities. So I read the Wikipedia page summary of Jaynes's book, and it basically says that the bicameral mind broke down because there were crises, that the existing methods of solving problems, neurological methods, were not solving. And there had to be an evolution of consciousness to enable more introspection, more language to solve these problems. So that's the Jaynes version of it, that consciousness evolves, things evolve to solve the negative side effects of human problem-solving capacities. And then the Nietzsche version of it would be some kind of, religion has negative side effects, so you need people to be more thinking for themselves or something like that. I'm not a Nietzsche expert. The Nietzsche experts can tell me if I've characterized one of his theses accurately, but it's the same idea that there's some kind of negative side effect of the existing problem-solving modes that needs to be overcome through some shift, some change. For Jaynes, it's the overcoming the bicameral mind. For Nietzsche, it's getting more of people thinking for themselves. And the reason I couch the whole thing, and this is my final point, the reason I couch it all in terms of human problem-solving capacities in the human mind is that that's kind of the driver. I mean, that's what makes us kind of different than other animals. And it's kind of, you can frame so many things like social science or medical science, whatever, in terms of like solving problems, humans coming up with solutions to problems, but the problems aren't perfect. And how do we deal with the negative side effects? So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bill. So that's a great point. And so let me try to address that as best as I can. I think the best, I'm going to go back to Sullivan, form follows function, because you can see this very clearly. What happens is that in the camel mode, somebody else has used the functions in order to create the forms. And the camels are using the forms that have been created by somebody else. And the breakdown of the bicameral mind that Julian Jaynes talks about is that when those forms stop working in the new context, the context has changed, the forms you're using is no longer working, it's not producing the results. Here we are talking about typically like civilizations being overrun by barbarians, massive droughts, things like that, kingdoms falling. And there, all the values, all the ideas that you had, in the camel mode or in the bicameral mode where you were listening to the God's voices, they stop working. And then you have two choices. You become either lions, you have to become a lion, or that means to challenge your previous ideas and take the heat for that. Or you become lost sheep, that you're just wandering around in the desert, hoping to find something. And both those things happen at the same. So that's the result of the forms not working anymore. So that is Julian Jaynes' version of that. So excellent point. All right.
Can I chime back in quickly?
Yes, please.
The trick in each of these transitions that has to overcome negative side effects of the existing solutions is to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there's times in history when they were throwing out a system, to get rid of its negative side effects, but they went too far. They threw out aspects of the solutions that were working. And my favorite example is from the French Revolution over the next 100 years. Like in the first 20 years, they threw out a bunch of stuff from the old system. And then over the next 80 years, they had to bring some of those things back because they needed them because they were valid solutions. So to separate out, which part of the existing solutions needs to be thrown out and which needs to be kept, that's not that's not an easy task, and it's not, people don't always get it right. So yeah, I'll stop there. And wait, the reason for the reason I'm pointing this out is because sometimes, you know, translating the solutions that the mind comes up with into real world forms that captures the good part of the solution and avoids the negative part of the solution, that's a translation exercise that is not easy to perform. I'll stop there.
Exactly. Thank you, Bill. So to put it in metaphorical terms, and this is what actually Nietzsche did. Nietzsche is a lion. Lion kills everybody, including the baby, sometimes. And then you have to kind of, you know, the baby has to be reborn as a child. So there is that issue that, you know, when somebody says no, because lions, the essence of a lion is a sacred no, which is saying that it's trying to get back to life, but it is getting back to life, getting back to function. It's just trying to do that, but it is doing that by destroying the previous forms, and many times, you know, many of the babies in the form. And then you have the next stage where you have to have a sacred yes, which is the child, which is building up things, you know, new forms based on new functions that are existing. Excellent point, Bill. All right, let's go next to Carl Jung. So now what we have done, folks, is that we've looked at, you know, as best as we can, you know, you have to realize that these people are giants. We can just do a very quick cursory look at it. But the purpose of doing that is to put them eventually side by side and see what we can learn. And most of the value is going to come from that. Okay. But in order to do that, you have to try to capture each of these giants in brief. So now we are on to Carl Jung. What does Carl Jung have to say about evolution of consciousness? Either individual or cultural, historical. Carl Jung is far harder to get at than Nietzsche, because his work is much larger and much diffuse. So would love to hear anybody who knows anything. So don't be shy. You can put your two cents down, and then we can go from there. Judy.
I'm a student of Jung. I'm not a practitioner nor nothing like that. And I've been in analysis for a long time, dream analysis. So I speak from that point of view. I think that what identifies Jung in this evolutionary period of understanding self, of understanding consciousness, of understanding the unconscious, is precisely that he gave the power to the individuals like me that are undergoing therapy to take charge of their individuation, what he calls, to take charge of our own analysis, to understand by reading, by talking, by dreams, by archetypes, by analogies, by myths, by culture. He gave us so many tools, and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote and he kept writing tons of things. I mean, there's no way that anybody can write so much, but he did it. And then after that, he wrote even more, and he stuck himself in a tower and he wrote even more for I don't know how many years, and nobody knew what he had written until like 40 years later. And then surprise, surprise, he wrote even more about analytical stuff, by magic, by alchemy, about all kinds of, you know, magical things. And so he gave us an imagination, all of us, from the beginning, but he even enforced that with much more later on in life. And he was rational, and at the same time he was intuitive, and he dealt with the unconscious mainly as his primal source. And I think that making what he is famous for saying, making the unconscious conscious, is what's going to help us become individualized. And that's the word that he used over and over and over. So I'm a fanatic of him, and anytime I can take a course on Jung, I'll take it. But and I love dream analysis, and I'm right now and writing about active imagination. I imagine all these things. So he sets the imagination going on fire, you know. Other so I think that's what it is. The other ones are great, and I wish I could know more about the other people but I don't know that much, so I won't even say. But I know that what Jung did to me was give me that intensity to understand myself and others, because it's not you're alone. One isn't alone. One is always connected, and that was his final message was that we're all connected, and through alchemy and through these mysterious numinous ways, we're all connected. So basically, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Judy. Appreciate that. Let's go to Laura next, followed by Andy and Eleanor. Laura.
Yeah, so I'm not super knowledgeable about Carl Jung. I've only read a few of his books, but from my understanding, humanity, in his view, started with the primitive mystique, or no, it's the participation mystique. And this was kind of like the idea that there was no individuality in tribal societies, and that we were all just participating in a form that was not fully conscious, because there was no self-consciousness. And he sees this in many creation stories. So he believes that we had to assimilate all objects that were around us, which created archetypes. And this is the only way we were able to form individuality, as well as distinction. Distinction would not have existed without this process. And I believe that he believed that our soul was kind of hidden underneath all of these assimilated objects. So the point of individuation was to find the soul through separating ourselves. Because there's like two things. There's ego consciousness, that's the thing that separates us. And then there's also the soul that's still there. And he sometimes called that the self. But in his earlier works, he called it the soul. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that's all I can say on what he thought the goal is there.
Great points. Thank you, Laura. Maritza, can you moderate for a short time? I need to make a quick call.
Absolutely.
It's going to be Andy, Eleanor, and Dave next.
Yep, I see. Welcome, Andy. Please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, so as I understand it, Jung saw the object of Jung's studies was not consciousness in particular, it was the psyche, which is more, which encompasses not only consciousness, but also the unconscious, the personal unconscious, which he called the shadow, and the collective unconscious. But he did speak about consciousness, of course, and I think he saw it as kind of like a mountain rising up from like the ocean of the unconscious. And, I think he saw, consciousness is ultimately like a separation of the mind or the individual from the unconscious layer. And of course, he saw a lot of modern man's mental problems. He attributed that to basically this separation, this cleaving away from the unconscious. And therefore, his whole system is basically about how to, reestablish a connection to the unconscious so that we can, receive the healing and the connection and the vigor that ultimately resides on that layer. I was actually also interested in what was said previously about this idea when forms decay or are no longer usable, we have to create new forms. And actually, that's what Jung said about our modern man's religious symbolism, that it was no longer serving its psychic function. And therefore, that also causes problems for modern man because, our religion is supposed to somehow be a conduit to the collective unconscious through its symbolism. But once that symbolism no longer worked, once those religious forms decay and are just meaningless formalisms, we then no longer have that toolkit, that way of, integrating the unconscious into the consciousness, and then we become like the lost sheep that were referred to. So I just thought those were some interesting points. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Next up is Dave. Go ahead, Dave.
Did we get Eleanor?
Nope, she's skipping.
Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, to me, the great thing about Jung was type, the personality type, the INTJ, and all this wonderful stuff. And it's interesting because I think everybody assumed Jung did it, but it was actually two women that studied his work, came up with the personality type thing. Because I think previous to that, I think we were living in a cookie cutter world that everybody's identical. And this was a start of understanding that we're different, that some of us confront the world inside out, some outside in, and judgmental, and introvert, extrovert, this, that, and the other. I think were great breakthroughs in consciousness. And as been mentioned before, individuation is the big work to be done, and confronting your shadow. And also has been mentioned, the subconscious, the bottom part of the iceberg. That there's so much of us, and I think that was a major part of his career, was trying to understand his own subconscious. He did so much dream work trying to understand his subconscious. So, great man. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. A couple of you have touched upon the individuation aspect, and I also think that that's one of the great contributions of Jung is the individuation. The idea of the concept that the process of becoming the person that we are inherently meant to be. I think that's great, and then it's the idea that it involves integrating the conscious and the unconscious elements of the psyche through individuation. One's consciousness evolves, becoming more comprehensive and holistic. And I think that's like, well, who doesn't want that to be a goal of theirs, right? Um, and he looks at it from so many different aspects. It's the there's the encountering the shadow, the anima, the animus, the encounter with the self, the symbols of the self, personal myth, integration. These, and then there's challenges and backslides, and these are all aspects of this transformative process. And I think that it's you. Several of you have touched upon the idea. It's a journey. It's that movement towards self-realization and wholeness, and I guess being more authentically oneself. And he grounds it in these different personal experiences, and then the universal archetypal patterns for most of his concepts there. Hi, Shikat. Are you
Hi,
back?
I'm back.
Your
I'm back.
timing is impeccable.
Okay, so basically everybody's comments are done.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So let me go ahead and comment on some of the comments. I heard most of them, so I'm sorry if I missed some things, but I think most people actually pointed out something which is very deep, that Jung's work starts not at the camel level, but at the previous level. That's why the four things are important. The Jung's work is really focused on getting the tribal consciousness right, because that, like, psychologically, that's the foundation on which camel rides. Camel rides on the monkey, on the primate, or primate heritage. So it's the whole of evolutionary psychology and all of that. And Jung really focused on that. I think several people mentioned that, of focusing on the unconscious, trying to understand that, about this mystic primitive aspect, the deepest part of it, things which are not conscious yet, all of that, which is called depth psychology. It's all in that the first phase, the starting phase. And that's why it is important to kind of focus on that, because you can't really understand all these three people without that. Okay, so that is huge. Secondly, what Jung has done is quite remarkable, really. So firstly, he says, look, you have to start with the unconscious. But unlike most people who start with the unconscious, and I got just completely fascinated by it, he shows you the power of the conscious. As Judy rightly put, it's all about making the unconscious conscious. The process of individuation is to expand your ego. Ego is whatever it is that you're conscious of. What it is saying is that he has this larger concept of self, which encompasses everything. And he says, don't forget the self, because we can very easily focus on whatever it is that we are consciously aware of and regard that as our identity, which is like the ego, or and there is this thing which is at the edge of consciousness. You may not be aware of it too much, but you have to be on the premise of continuously discovering things that are at the edge of your consciousness so that you can integrate them into your conscious thought, conscious direction. And the process of individuation is that it's kind of expanding yourself to, and it's an ongoing process. So he starts at the tribal level. That is one thing. And he also has elements of the child level in there. He doesn't do that much work on the camel part or the lion part of the problems that come of civilization. In the bulk of his work is not about that. Bulk of his work is about unconscious and conscious. So unconscious and the self-conscious, I would put it. So that's where he's so he's like tribal man and child is what he's focusing on. Tribal man quite a bit, but it's really amazing what work he's done on the child. So that's how I see him. All right, now the last one, last but not the least, is Julian Jaynes. Does anybody else? So anybody have to say anything about Julian Jaynes? Of where all of these come in? Okay, I'm going to start. I'm a big fan of Julian Jaynes. I think in terms of understanding us, Julian Jaynes is, what shall I say? He has elements that both these people lack. In some ways, what Julian Jaynes is doing, Marisa focused on the bicameral mind. That is basically a portrayal of the camel. Then there is the breakdown of the bicameral mind, which is like lost sheep and lion, that phase. But really, the heart of his work is that on child. And he has the most comprehensive way of conceptualizing the child. The ultimate, the ultimate of this. So I don't want to talk too much about it for now, because that would expand the discussion too much, because in some ways he's the odd man out. Like his focus is on the child part. Like if you want to put, as I was saying, Jung is at the tribal man part plus a little bit of child. The attention of Nietzsche is focused on the camel versus the lion, but many aspects of the lions that he talks about are actually parts of the tribal man. So he's going in that. He has some elements of the child too. Julian Jaynes, he has the most comprehensive understanding of the child. So that's what I'll just say this as a teaser. and let's see what people have to say, and then we can go from there. Eleanor.
Yeah, Julian Jaynes is basically showing us how he comes from more irrational part, and he explains that we are moving from irrational into the rational part, and he's using the bicameral, basically two-chambered mind to explain the development, evolution of our brain. And he is even performing experiments and could even prove that we are still hallucinating if we activate certain parts of brain, and that our irrational thoughts are basically, our rationality is coming from our irrationality and is building up on our society or social structures, and our brain is adapting and growing with the social development. And yeah, so far, thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Next up is Dave. Dave, go ahead. Dave, you need to unmute though. Dave, can you hear us? I don't know what's going on with Dave. Dave, you're on mute. Okay, it looks like Dave is looking at something else. Dave, you're saying something. You're on mute. Okay, I don't know what's going on. All right, Dave. Okay, maybe he's not. Maritza, you can hear me, right? Okay.
I hear you just fine, and I see that Dave's lips are moving.
I don't know what's going on with Dave. Dave, are you going to talk to us or just to yourself? You're on mute.
Is my turn now?
Yes, now. Yes.
I'm sorry. I got caught by a phone call, but
Okay.
yeah, I was thinking of Julian Jaynes, and I'm sorry I didn't remember his name originally, but wasn't it Saturday mornings? And I think the gentleman's name was Brian. He'd been in Japan, and I don't know if he worked directly with James or whether he just read his work, and I think he's writing a book of his own. But it was so impressive to me, and what I recall that Julian Jaynes had studied ancient texts and looked at not so much word choice, but phrasing and how people express themselves as an indication of what they were thinking. And I think, and it was interesting how Brian was describing this, even differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Bible. And as I recall, I forget it, maybe it was about emotion or whatever, but in the olden days, there were things that they didn't even think about expressing because it wasn't in their mind. And to me, it's so interesting that I think we take consciousness for granted. I look out my eyeballs, I see the world, I've got my senses, I hear, see, touch, feel, hear, smell. But it's more than that. And I think it's interesting because you think, oh, that's concrete, it's always been that way. But no, I think Brian made the point, and I really agree that it evolves. And I will make the point I saw online months ago now, a thing called Can You Read This? And it's a paragraph, and the first and last letters are correct, but they mix the interior letters. And I can read with no problem, but they said 40% can or 40% can or whatever, I forget. But it's obvious there are consciousness differences between people and how far different people have evolved. As I said, we're not cookie cutters, but yeah, all this is very interesting, revealing that, of course, we can argue about whether we were apes on the tree or whatever, but we have definitely evolved. But I think right now we take the viewpoint, well, we've always been this way. We've always felt this. We've always done that and the other. But it's so interesting to study how things may really change and how they may change in the future, artificial intelligence or not. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave. So, and one point that Dave is making is very important, and that is that it is actually very hard to put yourself in the position of people for different time in history, because you tend to actually project your own consciousness into them. So to actually understand how the consciousness was, that is enormously hard. And you have to really watch out for that, for kind of just this projection. And Julian Jaynes has amazing things to say. But what I want to do is firstly, I'm going to have Maritza talk first, and then we will go there. Maritza, go ahead.
No, I was just going to piggyback a little bit off of what Dave was saying. And, the idea of what's fascinating to me about the concept of, that Julian Jaynes presents to us is the transition, the idea that the system that we had in place had to change by necessity because our society was evolving and becoming more complex. And we needed to be more flexible. We needed to be more adaptable. And this was for decision-making purposes that I guess we didn't have a decision-making system, as it were. And to me, I think it's super interesting when you think about, the emergence of the individual introspective consciousness is kind of answering that question of the, all of us are familiar with that internal, eternal debate, right? Like our inner consciousness is kind of our question and mechanism internally. And that, as I understand it, and again, not an expert, as I understand what Julian Jaynes is saying, is that that's, this decision-making system arose from the need for more adaptability and complexity within our societal systems. And, he talks about the transition to an introspective consciousness being potentially influenced from societal change. So the old system of hearing directives from like the gods or the God voices or leaders that seemed godlike, it was just not efficient enough anymore. So our shift, our evolutionary path was forged out of necessity. And that just makes so much sense to me. It seems incredibly more concrete and realistic to me than some of the other paths that we've identified here tonight. Like it just seems so easily accessible. Like I can really wrap my mind around that as an evolutionary trait because it just makes so much sense the way he lays it out. The path, it's also less esoteric than would be Jung's or Nietzsche's. Not that they don't have their own power and might in their own respect, but I just appreciate it, that Julian Jaynes' theory, wow, so comprehensive, and it truly does delve into the metaphysical and really deep thinking there. It's also so very grounded in like a basic. He steps you through it. Like I can really see, and it makes sense to me, and I hope that that's something easily visible to several others.
Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Eleanor.
Yeah, piggybacking on Maritza. Basically, Julian Jaynes and bicameral mind theory, again, he proved it actually that it's even correct. So when early humans perceived their own voices as God voices and didn't assimilate it as their own thoughts, and basically they were thinking they are talking to gods, and they gave the gods different names. And this is where Brian McQuay is researching and following up actually on Julian Jaynes, and he's basically researching the entire Bible, and he thinks even that the names evolved during lifetime, during the certain periods of time, and even names were changed. But it's a same one and the same person we are referring to, or one and the same God, basically. Actually, there are similarities with Carl Jung because speaking of gods, Carl Jung is all about unconscious, and this is where archetypes coming from. And Julian Jaynes, down the road on a way of evolution, basically we learned how to get more conscious about our voices and perceive them as our self. And this is where the unconscious in Carl Jung gets recognized, arises from the unconscious, and gets integrated into the self. There is a connection, actually. They are built into each other, all three. And Nietzsche is more about philosophy, and he is I'm not very familiar with Nietzsche. I'm more into psychology, but Carl Jung is more about the unconscious, and Julian Jaynes and Brian McQueen are more about the consciousness. They're building onto each other.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Eleanor. So now let's shift to comparing. So we've spent time talking about each of them separately. Now, I want to start with Carl Jung and Nietzsche, because I think there the overlap is more. So I want to look at comparison between Carl Jung and Nietzsche. So what is it that is common? So you can answer any of these questions or all of these questions. What is it that is common to Carl Jung and Nietzsche? What is it that is different between Carl Jung and Nietzsche? So just comparing and contrasting Carl Jung and Nietzsche on consciousness, evolution of consciousness. I don't know. I mean, Marisa, tell me what you think of this, because all of these people, though they are talking about evolution of consciousness, they're also talking about evolution of individual consciousness, like different stages that you go through, different states that you are in. So you can approach it both ways. That's what I was thinking of. Is that okay? Marisa, does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to talk about comparison between Carl Jung and Nietzsche on their view of evolution of consciousness, either in society or in an individual, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. We'll start with Eleanor. Eleanor, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as far I remember, again, I'm not very into Nietzsche. I actually don't like him, but as far I remember, the Übermensch is a figure of type of Superman where it's a self-awareness and assimilating the unconscious into the conscious and growing, developing the personality, basically individualism. And this is where Carl Jung and Nietzsche have similarities for me, because while we are reflecting on our reflection and projection, and then from the down world of the unconscious is a Superman arising, and it's a new myself, would be basically. Sorry, I can't explain it better, but this is how I perceive it for myself. So, and then there's also second similarity in history, because Nietzsche is also writing about Dionysian and Apollonian, and this is, I think, similarities to Carl Jung, because Carl Jung is coming from a lot of history. He is a recollection of history, basically, from all over the world.
Thank you, Eleanor. This is a theme of kind of return to the Dionysian, return to the primitive, is actually common to both Jung and Nietzsche in their own way. So that's an excellent point. Next up is Dave. Folks, go ahead and comment and just stick to what you know. You don't have to be speculative about things that you don't know. Just talk about what you know. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, Shrikant, it seems to me that Nietzsche was really interested in society and maybe society's effect on the individual. I know he's very interested in religion, where to me, Jung was very much interested in the individual himself and maybe individual growing out into society. So to me, they're kind of at different polarities from each other. Thank you.
That's very interesting point. I mean, the issue of focus on individual and focus on society. The way I'm seeing it is both of them are really focused on the individual, and they're focused on society in very different ways. So it's like somebody like Nietzsche is a very strong critic of society, and he sees all of these things that society does that really puts the kind of the height of individuals. It just stops individuals from doing that. Whereas the way in which Jung is approaching it is that when he's talking about society, he's firstly talking about society much earlier in the primitive tribal sense. And he's trying to look for patterns in society which are conducive, which form the base of the individual. So that collective unconscious is about kind of the positive things that are there, that are that are like the background in the unconscious of an individual. So they have very interestingly different ways of focusing on the individuals. Again, when it comes to individual, the way in which Carl Jung focuses on it is your ability of being conscious and relentlessly expanding to cover your entire self, the process of individuation. Whereas a lot of what Nietzsche is talking about is this tremendous artistic creation on one hand, which is entirely personal, and then automatically the conflicts with the society. So it's a very interesting look at how they look at individual and society. So Dave, thank you so much for zeroing in on that. Next up is Andy.
Yeah, so Eleanor, I think, referred earlier to Nietzsche as mainly a philosopher, but I find it interesting that Nietzsche oftentimes referred to himself as a psychologist. And I think in much of his writings that I've read, he seemed to be focused on his or he was keen on basically healing humanity from a decadent system of values and ideals that somehow led to a decline. Well, not somehow. He explained how these things led to a decline in life. So I think Nietzsche was more about rehabilitating, rehabilitating the impulses of man, the vital instincts of man, rather than kind of constructing a philosophical system that's abstract and not involved with that. So, but as to consciousness and how it relates to Carl Jung, I mean, Nietzsche's notion of consciousness. I mean, again, like, I'm not so sure how focused Nietzsche was on consciousness itself, but like on our instincts and our impulses being kind of atrophied by malignant systems of values and ideas and all that. But I guess where I could find some similarity between the two is Nietzsche believed in this idea of the will to power, right? And Jung often said that things like if you don't make the unconscious conscious, the unconscious will direct you and you will call it fate. So in order to actually gain power over our fate, we have to engage in this process that Jung called individuation. And so I don't know, is Jung's will to power somehow tied into this individuation process that seems to give the individual more power over his fate. And yeah, but as it ties to consciousness, I'm not sure. Anyway.
Wonderful. Andy, great comments. Thank you so much. Next up is Eleanor. Eleanor, go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't heard Andy for a while. We used to have a Carl Jung group together. It was nice. So just I found it interesting that Dionysian in Carl Nietzsche. So Dionysian and Apollonian. So basically, it represents two different aspects of ourself. It's like a bicameral mind. One, Dionysian is representing the patient, ecstasy, dissolution, and art, culture, creativity. And Apollonian represent straightforward thinking, restraining, and rationality and self-control. And have you ever heard about this angel and devil in oneself when they speak to each other? On one shoulder is angel and another shoulder is devil, and they're kind of like having a conversation together. And this is what actually a human mind is from. It arises from the bicameral conversation, and sometimes it has to go more in art, and sometimes it has to go more rational, and both are restraining each other and checking onto each other. So it has to be a balance, and this is where yin and yang coming into connection to. If one is overhand, it's not good. So it has to be in balance.
Thank you, Eleanor. Next up is Maritza.
Man, so many good comments, Srikanth. Hard to decide which direction to go. I'm intrigued by the idea of comparing will to power with individuation. I think Andy mentioned that, and you may have touched upon it, and I think it's interesting because the individuation, it's an internal process, but I've often thought of the will to power as more external than internal, with elements of both. But considering it now, I can see similarity there, where they are both concepts are just struggling with the realization of individual potential and of self-assertion. I can see that in both concepts, and they're both about overcoming. But I would say that Jung's individuation is more about integration. I can see where we could make the case for there being necessity for integration in Nietzsche's will to power, where he's mentioning it. But one glaring difference is Nietzsche views societal norms as something that have to be entirely eschewed, and Jung, and this is something that I really admire about this concept, is that Jung is saying that there's a necessity. So we do need to find a way to transcend, for the most part, but there is a need and a place for societal norms, and I think that kind of meshes a little bit more if we were to go back and bring in Julian Jaynes a little, because it's the idea of, and I think Bill had said that, you don't throw everything out with the water. You're going to keep some of the elements. Some things are necessary as you grow and transform. And that's to me, I'm seeing here that that's one big aspect that's missing from Nietzsche's concepts. Nietzsche is very much get rid of this, make it all go away. And you were saying the lion, he's got this very fierce rejection, the very fierce and strong no. But there's not a lot of interwoven bringing the things from before that will help you as you transform. And I think that that's it's more visible in a lot of Jungian concepts, and also even in Julian Jaynes as he's going forth and explaining to us the transformation. So I find them to be it's fascinating that both of them are, telling us that individuals have to assert themselves and they have to create their own, but it's in an entirely, it's like a slightly different aspect. And so yeah, I just wanted to kind of explore that a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you. The best I can put it is that I think the entire valence of, when you look at like all of Jung's thought as a whole and Nietzsche's thought as a whole, on one hand, both of them are saying that amazing things are possible to an individual, but they are differing very strongly about their views about societies. When you look at it as a whole, everything that they have said about societies, Nietzsche is very negative about the society, whereas Jung is by and large positive about the society. He says that there is integration between the social and the individual, and it's not about power over other people. Whereas Nietzsche's idea is that individual, in order to improve, basically exerts power over other people. That is, so it's like, individual against the society is very deeply built into how he's thinking about things. Now, all of this is very, we've not even begun to look at these people. So for example, Carl Jung, his deepest ideas, I find the best ideas on this is on this topic can be found in his 7 Sermons to the Dead. By far, my favorite work of his. And so let me change the topic slightly to expand the topic. We're looking at progression, right? Another way of looking at progression is, where is it going? What's the ideal that each of these people have? Okay, and I want to put forth the ideal of Julian Jaynes and Carl Jung, and to some extent Nietzsche. I'm least familiar with Nietzsche, and I'm not that big a fan. I think I have a lot of respect for him because he questioned things at a time that needed questioning. But he's a lion, and he's very, very good at tearing, rotten things down. But in the process, he's killing a whole bunch of things as well, including God, for example. Whereas what Julian Jaynes does, not Julian Jaynes, but let's take Carl Jung, is that he says, okay, his God is called Abraxas in the 7 Sermons to the Dead. He's the one who is living at the edge of order and chaos, that is going between the particular and the universal. That is, he's universal in some ways and particular in some ways. And he is living in the midst of all the conflicts and being effective at doing that. So it's really, really powerful idea. I cannot fully describe it, but we've done a whole series on 7 Sermons to the Dead. So if you look at the Carl Jung series playlist on 52 Living Ideas YouTube channel, you will find the series on 7 Sermons to the Dead. It's just incredibly powerful idea. And it takes everything that we have talked about in Carl Jung, and whatever we have said is just pales in comparison with what he's saying about the human potential. He's saying the real human potential is the abraxas of this person taking on all the negatives and pursuing all the positives at the same time, each moment. So it's a very terrible God, and it is a tremendously positive God at the same time. Okay, so that is the level of thinking which is really, really profound, which Carl Jung is capable of. Now let's go to Julian Jaynes. Okay, I deliberately wanted to keep Julian Jaynes towards the end, because Julian Jaynes, in terms of understanding the child in the progression of tribal man, camel, lion, and child. So far, we've discussed what Julian Jaynes thinks about the camel, which is what the bicameral mind is. Then we've talked about the lion and the lost sheep, where he's talking about then the bicameral mind breaks down. That means everything that was working has stopped working. There is drought. Everything that you were doing, kingdoms have been overthrown, and you are a refugee going from place to place. And then you have to figure out what to do. All your ideas, all your voices that you are hearing that will give you surefire ways of what you need to do are gone. And you have to produce something. That is the beginning of Julian Jaynes' work. All of the things that we have said, everybody, whatever people identify with Julian Jaynes is really the beginning, just the like preamble to his work. His core work is in the area of the child. What he's saying there is something profound, which neither Carl Jung nor Nietzsche come anywhere near. He has a conception of what consciousness is. By consciousness, he means self-consciousness. And he's saying that he has a very important take on language itself, the role of language in civilization. What he's saying is that, let me go ahead. So I'm going way out there. Okay, I'm going to say this. I'm going to just give you the summary of Julian Jaynes' thought, because you can't really leave this comparison without dealing with his main idea. So this is his main idea. Okay, I'm going to try to explicate it. Okay, I don't know whether I'm going to succeed or not, because it is such a revolutionary concept that it took me a long time to just grasp what he's saying. But it's a very simple concept. Okay, what he's saying is that consciousness is an analog of reality constructed through language, specifically constructed through metaphors. So what he's saying is that consciousness, see, you're in the middle of nowhere. Okay, everything that you're using to lead your life is gone. So what you do is that you start simulating reality. So consciousness is a simulation process where you say, I could do this, or I could do this. What is the, what if I went this way? What are the dangers? If I went this way, what are the dangers? What are the advantages? Can I do something in the middle? And you're working all of it out in your consciousness using language. You're using metaphors to start with things in reality, in existence, to create a metaphor that refers to something inside. And you're thinking of manipulating. Take the example of grasp. There is grasping with your hand, which is outside. Then you have a concept of grasp, mental grasp, which is inside you, which you imagine yourself as an analog eye, or what he calls analog eye, that is operating through this metaphorical space, which is the existence. You're saying, I could do this, I could go there, I could do this. That's the analog eye considering. So if you look at grasp, physical action is transmitted into something like grasp inside your mind. And then that is used to grasp things like business. I'm trying to grasp business. Now you can't grasp business like this. So there is this loop that metaphors does. So it is a theory of, it is saying that we developed concepts of consciousness. Like Dave or Eleanor were talking about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, between the Iliad and Odyssey. In Iliad, it's not self-conscious. Iliad is not self-conscious. Odyssey is. Iliad uses thumos, because thumos is like blood. Okay, it's word for blood. And that gets transformed into the concept of courage, which is a psychic, psychological concept or moral concept. So from outside, or spirit, wind, pneuma, wind gets converted into spirit. So there are many, 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 many examples of that. And what he's pointing out is that transition from people just listening to the voices. Think of it as just children obeying parents. Moving from that, the child becoming independent and being able to project their own paths and trying to figure out what they should do. So now I don't know whether I know that most of you are not familiar with Julian Jaynes. We have done 30 meetups on Julian Jaynes, including many introductory meetups with multiple people. So you can look at the Julian Jaynes playlist. I'm telling you, he is order of magnitude higher in terms of what the modern consciousness is like. So firstly, just questions on Julian Jaynes. I don't know whether I have communicated what I was trying to say. Please go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you have any questions. Just focus on questions at this point. Is this clear or is this completely confusing? What do you think? DLJ, what says you?
Okay, you want questions? So I prepared a 30-minute critique on Jung, but I won't, just to annoy Andy. But for Jaynes, does he go to system theory at all? So does he talk about inputs and outputs of consciousness or retrieval systems or anything like that?
No. He's far more kind of focused on the conscious process. He's mostly focused on language. He's looking at, systems theory is much later concept. And so what he's doing is he's doing something far more primitive, saying, okay, when you think of people, we've studied, Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, and Gospel of John. What are the people doing there which is different from people 1,000 years before their time? That is what he's trying to identify. Eleanor, what's your question?
So can I just quickly? So I think you got to give Nietzsche some credit because he was also onto that, and he was somewhat earlier. So I guess he didn't know quite as much as Jaynes knew later on, right? But he was definitely on that communication element to it. So whereas Jung is more on the well, no, I'm not going to.
No, that's a good point. We can never forget that Nietzsche is a philologist. He actually knows all these languages amazingly well. Nietzsche, in terms of just the creativity, is amazing. I consider him to be just amazing artist of what he's able to portray and how well he's able to portray it. All the philosophical points he makes, the flair with which flair and power with which he and clarity with which he presents them is just incredible. So I have a lot of respect for Nietzsche, but what Julian Jaynes is showing is what is needed for civilization. What Nietzsche is saying that something is wrong with civilization. Let's burn it all. Something like that, to put it very simply. Whereas Julian Jaynes is looking and saying, okay, what is making this civilization work? Just like Jung is going back and saying, what is it that is making human beings tick in the most primitive level that is common to all cultures? And that is the foundation. So in that sense, both the valence of both Jung and Julian Jaynes is extremely positive. In some ways, Julian Jaynes is like, he does for consciousness and civilization what Jung does for the primitive. And by primitive, I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It is the foundation. It is the foundation of our psyche, and our consciousness rides on the top of that. So to use Daniel Kahneman's term, what Jung is doing is that he's showing you how system 1 works with a little bit of system 2 thrown in and the interactions between them. Whereas Julian Jaynes is really a very deep dive into system 2 and the role of it in civilization. Next up is Bill. Bill, go ahead.
Thanks. Can I screen share something?
Very quickly, give me just a second.
Take your time.
Hold on. You're talking about
Yeah,
Julian Jaynes?
it's something that addresses what you were talking about.
Okay, sure. Give me just a second here. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
So this is from a textbook on communication. That's like an undergraduate college textbook. It's 2 paragraphs. Quote, consider the case of the famous wild boy of Aveyron in France, who appeared to have spent his early childhood without human contact. The boy was discovered in January 1800 while digging for vegetables in a French village garden. He could not speak, and he showed no behaviors one would expect in a social human. More significant was his lack of any identity as a human being. As author Shattuck put it, the boy had no human sense of being in the world. He had no sense of himself as a person related to other persons. Only after the influence of a loving foster mother did the boy begin to behave as a human. Contemporary accounts support the essential role of communication plays in shaping identity. In some cases, feral children who were raised with limited or no human contact have demonstrated communication patterns similar to those of the animals that they grew up around. They do not appear to have developed a sense of themselves as humans before interacting with other people. Similarly, in Danny's story, that book tells of an abandoned child who was rescued by a loving family and taught to communicate. And after considerable time and investment, the child was ultimately able to say of herself, "I pretty." So I put these, facts, evidence on the table to address some of the things that Shrikant was talking about with respect to childhood and metaphors. So the question raised by these cases of these children is, what happens when a child does not get any normal socialization? And these paragraphs describe what happens when a child is not getting the normal socialization. They certainly have instincts that they act on, animal instincts, to meet their needs by picking vegetables in a garden, but they're not getting all of the apparatus that Shrikant was talking about in terms of language and metaphors for containing some animal instincts, channeling others, and harnessing others to even higher purposes that are above the level of the instincts. They get all that through language and socialization. And part of that may relate to kind of connections between the right brain and the left brain, to connect back to Jaynes's theories. What a child gets is a bunch of connections between the right brain and the left brain to act as filters and channels and containment, devices and harnessing devices, so that everything that's coming up from the unconscious can be sorted into the stuff that is pro-social and the other stuff that's not, or the stuff that is in one's own best elevated enlightened self-interest, and the other stuff that is not. And then I'll close with this point. All that I've said so far opens up kind of a methodology of analysis for looking at the functional aspects and the dysfunctional aspects of socialization. Socialization, again, is one of these solutions that's not perfect. It's got some things it does well and some things it does not so well, depending on the type of socialization involved by parents, communities, etc. And then you can look at all the dysfunctions that all these 3 authors are talking about: Nietzsche and Jung and Jaynes, in terms of like remedying the suboptimalities of socialization processes. And each of these 3 authors probably has their own angle on how to remedy the suboptimalities of socialization processes. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. Can you stop sharing?
Sure.
Thanks. Next up is Eleanor. Eleanor, go ahead.
Thank you.
The general principle is that I try to get.
It's okay. I'm not taking it so seriously.
Somebody who has not spoken much, so I always.
No, I don't know. Don't even worry about it.
Yeah.
So I'm taking it with a humor. Actually, I found it funny. So I just wanted to suggest something new as you were speaking, and you were trying to make an analogy between Julian Jaynes and this is where my question is going, Julian Jaynes and Nietzsche. And you said bicameral mind when the breakdown starts, this is where the line comes in. And I thought maybe not. Maybe I can suggest that one chamber of the brain is the camel, and the second chamber would be the child. And then when two argue or having a dialogue with each other, then the third one would arise, and this would be the Übermensch in Nietzsche, and this would be basically the individuation, the wholeness in Carl Jung, and this would be in Julian Jaynes the development of the bicameral mind. So basically the line is the result of the development in a bicameral mind. And then I wanted just to add something, that Nietzsche is more piggybacking on the society and moral. His Superman is arising from the understanding the society and acting towards society, or building up on the society. He's kind of like doing more reflection and projection. And he's coming from the collective conscious, basically, which is Carl Jung coming more from the collective unconscious. And Julian Jaynes is integrating all three of them, basically, and is building. He's so different. He's more biological almost than chemical. As the other, Friedrich Nietzsche is more philosopher, and Carl Jung is more historical or antique historical and psychological. It's a lot of theory, and Julian Jaynes is just realistic. Yeah.
Thank you, Eleanor. Next up is going to be Dave. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, just inspired by what Bill showed us, and that was an amazing thing. But reminded me about brain development. Language, for example. Most of us are very jealous of folks that grew up in Europe exposed to many languages, and it's very common for a European to know 6 or 8 languages very, very well. And I hate to say this, but Americans, very few of us can even speak English. But also music. You know, I'm an amateur musician. I think I heard someone say that if you haven't heard music or heard musical scales or whatever, I mean, you can hear music, but you can't appreciate it, and you won't hear if a pitch is flat or sharp or whatever. You don't hear the intricacies of it. Oh, and of course, that also brings into mind Piaget. I don't know if we studied in 52 Ideas or whether it was through Jordan Peterson, but it seems like babies are born hardwired, a certain amount of programming already, because you can put young children up, you know, in front of a little puzzle, and they will all get the same wrong answer, because it's like it's pre-wired in their brains, and you know, across cultures. And so it's really amazing. I think we're just starting to learn about brain development, which I think, you know, figures into our consciousnesses. And the other thing is, one of my books I read about a guy that had part of his head blown off and lost part of his brain, and started speaking obscenities and miscussing and this, that, and the other. That after several years, regained to normal, because I think we're starting to understand how the brain can rewire itself. So just fascinating stuff about.
Thank you, Dave. All right, Maritza. So, what do you think so far of the discussion?
I'm learning lots. I really appreciate the connections different people are making. Yeah, some things seeing that I had not considered. So it's always exciting for me when I can make new connections. Um, I'm curious to hear more on your thoughts of Julian Jaynes, because you know you started us out by saying he was of the 3 heavies, he was the heaviest weight.
He's his heaviest weight for several reasons. I think he understands civilization better. In some ways, Carl Jung is telling, and this is not a criticism of these people, okay? I'm always looking at these people in their own times, and they basically, each of them have took on the largest problems that interested them, which was actually a very critical problem, and they had amazing things to say about it. I'm looking at it just from my perspective here. What I'm saying is Carl Jung went and said, look, we're not really cognizant of our evolutionary heritage. Okay, but he's not focused on the evolutionary heritage like entire evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology. He goes and tries to examine it in the best way he can at his times, and which is to look at common patterns that are seen in every culture. And he tries to identify things about them, which is fundamental to human psyche. So he's going in that first, his really core work in what is called the depth psychology is in that part. At the same time, he has a lot of respect for the conscious mind, which typically people who go into depth psychology get excited about it. They are actually anti-conscious in some ways. So, but he has that, which is actually very beautiful. So I like him a lot. I learned a lot from him. He's also taken in a lot of the axial age work, whether it is Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, etc. He's very deep into that. So he's able to see some patterns which other people can't, and he gives like psychological explanations of it. So he's he's at that level. He's not that interested in what makes civilization tick, what makes Egypt work. It's not something that really his focus is. Now, Nietzsche is a critic of modern times, and he's saying we're missing something. Something is happening, and he actually sounds that alarm. Not really alarm, he just states it out front. God is dead. Something has changed, and he takes a front, and his criticism is very powerful, and you have to engage with that and see where he's coming from. But I think a lot of it is kind of going back to the primitive roots. He doesn't understand it as well as Carl Jung does, of this richness, which is both positive and negative. He just goes into almost like with the will to power, he's kind of going, I'm just talking in very large generalities. The Carl Jung gets the primate nature of human beings, the social nature. Whereas this guy is going back to almost the reptilian thing of saying, power. He's not really, doesn't get the social angle, the crucial importance of social things as well. What Julian Jaynes is doing is that he's saying he's really focused on the axial age and everything that came afterwards. He's saying, what built civilization? And he goes back and forth between the internal and external. In some ways, both Carl Jung and Nietzsche worship the internal, worship the personal experience. Julian is different because he's seen the relationship between the existence and consciousness. When he says consciousness is analog of reality, automatically both are connected. So in that sense, in some deep way, Carl Jung and Nietzsche are like in the Platonic school. They say, I want to uplift the conscious experience at the price of either not looking at or putting down the physical world. Whereas Julian Jaynes is all about saying that it's this loop going back between existence and consciousness. So he's Aristotelian in that respect. And his view of consciousness as a result of that is very, very different. He, of course, understands the tribal nature, because actually the bicameral mind uses the tribal nature as a way to achieve civilization, even with the tribal nature. So it's like monkey see, monkey do. You're saying, oh, big monkey is doing this, so I will do that. It's kind of like that. I'm obviously simplifying a lot of things here, but so that's why I think, I like, I'm a big fan of Julian Jaynes, because his ideas actually tell you what civilization is about, that it is about language, it is about writing, and it's about dealing with existence on a scale unimagined and just not possible without these tools. Go ahead, Marissa.
I was just gonna say, I find it fascinating that, Julian Jaynes is telling us that, our modern consciousness comes about from a result of societal complexities and development of metaphorical language, which allows for introspection, self-awareness, and narrative thought. So, you had mentioned a little bit ago that he doesn't actually go into the nuances of, societal culture, but he he does, like, indirectly, because I mean, you can't contemplate, like, metaphorical language without the effect of society and societal norms on it. Like, they're irrevocably intertwined, because our language is shaped through our interactions and as we go forth. So I think that's a fascinating thing to consider, that he does such a great job of explaining how we transition towards this new modern consciousness as opposed to ancient consciousness, that he doesn't have to delve into specific particulars, but he still makes it clear to us that there is an aspect of the societal in there, like it has to play a role, which I appreciate and respect, because I don't believe I could understand what he's saying about modern consciousness unless I also could understand that it was worked and come about through interactions within, because that's what, language, it's kind of a, it's like the whole washing, when things are washing together, you can't move separately from it. It's all interwoven. And I really respect that he manages to account for it without getting too down into it.
Can I comment on this? I completely agree with you. Okay, and I don't know in what context I was talking about this comparison, because I think I was doing comparison between the three. But let's look at Julian Jaynes and his view of society. Okay, by seeing language as the core part, he is focusing on society in a very deep, deep way. Because what he's saying is that, consciousness, individual consciousness, is an analog of reality. So think of it as you're creating a map using your language. When you're talking to somebody else, you're actually interacting with their map. You're going back and forth and saying, oh, I think it's like this. So he thinks that actual act of listening is to let the other people in your consciousness of saying, this is a new analog I that I'm going to project, and say, what is the viewpoint or what is the perspective that this person has? What is the map that this person has? And is my map correct? Is their map correct? Is there like and I can do of it? Can I do an intersection of it? And you're doing all of that in communication, in language, and you're working together. You are actually moving together. You're saying, should I go like this or should I go like this? Should we go like this or should we go like this? You are taking both the maps and you're doing that, and you're directing a joint action using those things. So it is very deeply social, because language is social. Language is individual and it is social. It is used to work together. You're trying to work together using language. You're saying, you know, I have figured out that if you take this path, you will go there. And you're using language to communicate that so we can go there together. Go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah. So she got the fascinating thing about what you're saying is that Nietzsche actually does speak about that, but his conclusion is different, is what makes it less rich than what Julian Jaynes is saying. So Nietzsche in on truth and lies in a non-moral sense, does go into the nature of truth and the role of language, and he does say that, you know, his argument is for truths being, you know, just metaphors that have become worn out and devoid of, you know, of force over time. But he's talking about language and how it's um how different specific words and their meanings can shape or limit or distort our understanding of the world. He does so from a more negative lens, and he focuses a little bit more on the limitations to our evolutionary process for consciousness, which, so while it comes to mind when reading Julian Jaynes, what's really enticing about Julian Jaynes is that he's focusing on how this helped to shape our growth, and it just makes more sense to me when you're looking at the evolution of not just language but the metaphors that have come about in our use of language. It follows through, and to me I think that the metaphor aspect of the language is what I see as a breakdown in some of the reasoning that Nietzsche makes for language.
No, excellent point. See, even when you look at language, right, the way in which he looks at, Julian Jaynes looks at language, or Jung looks at, you know, primitive societies, for example, it is basically to say yes, of saying, let me understand what these people are doing on a very massive scale. Okay, like both these people are just, you know, just immersing themselves into this, instead of trying to say, okay, I'm going to criticize this one particular thing about people around me that's really, really bad. Okay, there is a value to that, I'm not saying that, but in terms of moving the understanding forward, what Julian Jaynes is doing is saying, let's look at all of language. Let's look at how language changes over time. Why did it change? What kind of action was made possible by these changes? How does language, what he's saying essentially is the language is a correlate of civilization. It is the inner control mechanism for civilization, for action, and the scale at which the language can do that. Now that is so deep part of this is what made civilization possible. Now, if you take something like this and then just look at some criticism of it, I think you're missing the core point. You may be right in a very, like Nietzsche is all about criticism, okay? But you first need to understand how something is living and what is making it live before seeing some problems. All of these have issues, okay? The issue is that even language, once you've started using it, people will start using it mindlessly. And they are going to create, just like, you know, when you do habits, initially you come up with something which are good habits, which actually serve something, and then you're just doing it imitatively, and you have lost the purpose of what it is. And so that's the richness. So that's why I think Julian Jaynes is like in my books, it's like order of magnitude higher than these other two gentlemen. In some ways, he's later, so that is easier. You know, he's kind of, you know, I'm sure he's a very educated man. He has all of this in him, and then he's going further. But the area that he's going into is something really revolutionary. Go ahead, Marissa.
No, I would just agree. And yes, there's definitely something to be said for that. I think of the three, Julian Jaynes is also the one that's most seen to be saying, let's embrace. So while Jung spends a lot of time identifying the need for integration, I see it happening in a lot of what Jaynes is presenting to us. Whereas for Jung, it's kind of funny because we talk about individuation and that, but in so much of his works, there's not the literal integration. If that makes, I don't know if that makes sense. What I'm saying is, as you read Jung's materials, he speaks of the integration, but he himself doesn't usually do it. And Julian Jaynes is showing us how the integration process happens, which I find to be particularly enticing. So I would tend to agree with you. He's also a little bit more approachable than either Jung or Nietzsche's works would be, which is another, that I feel like, the whole idea of communication is you have to get the message from one to another. And Julian Jaynes's work, I think, does that pretty well.
Wonderful. Now I'm going to give a chance for people to talk about what they got from this meetup. We are using a very, very interesting format of taking three. And I think Marissa has done a brilliant job each and every time of choosing three and the theme that they are addressing. It's very interesting kind of similarities and differences. So I'm finding it just incredibly interesting. So just let me know what you guys think. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Keep your comments just on this topic and brief. Go ahead and type exclamation mark. How did it go? Or what did you learn from this meetup? You can take up to like 30 seconds, 45 seconds, something like that. Go ahead and type exclamation mark. Dave, what did you get?
What I got out of this is there were differences, but I think because these three gentlemen were in three different eras, and I think that was part of the explanation. Of course, they had different perspectives as well, but I think it was very instructive to take a examination of the different perspectives, the differences, the analogies, the parallels. I think it was a very good study. Thank you, Shrikant and Maritza.
Wonderful. Anybody else wants to comment on what you got from this meetup? Eleanor, what did you get from this meetup?
Yeah, I'm going to be short because I all of a sudden understand where the power of will of Nietzsche is coming into the play in comparing to Carl Jung and Julian Jaynes. Is basically the language. The power of will is basically the rise of the language. And as I understood by Julian Jaynes, the language is coming because the subconscious or the lesser prominent brain part needed voice, and the thoughts and the ideas needed expression. And the evolution of the symbolism or the words, how, for instance, one symbol means different words over the period of time, it arises through a development of society. And by Carl Jung is actually power of will and developing of language. Carl Jung is staying with the symbolism, ancient symbolism. This is it. And I like the idea of Bill he posted there. I hope he has time to say something about it.
Thank you. Next up is Bobby. Bobby, what did you get from the meetup?
I think for me, it's a personal journey. And when I read Nietzsche, I got value from the idea of finding my own meaning in life after the despair of realizing God is dead. So Nietzsche helped me there. Jung helped me psychologically, similar to the lady that said this earlier is gone, but the understanding my shadow exists and making it sort of my life's work to uncover that has helped me personally. So again, a personal take. Jaynes, never read. I now have a new journey to take, and I'm looking to see what profit I can get from it. I'm very impressed with all of you, and I'm very grateful to have been here today. So thanks.
Thank you, Bobby. Maritza, may I request you to put the Julian Jaynes playlist in the chat for anybody who wants to follow up on Julian Jaynes, because most of the people don't seem to be that familiar with Julian Jaynes.
That's
all right.
exactly what I was working on.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else about what you got? Oh, you already have it. Fantastic. Maritza, what did you get from the meetup?
Really enjoyed seeing the connection. I had not considered the camel, the lion, the tribal man, camel, lion, and child. I had not considered that in this comparison. So for me, that was a really fascinating aspect, and I liked seeing it interwoven. I also appreciated some of the connections that we made on the individuation that I had not considered, and that's one of my favorite aspects of Jung. So I really liked seeing others connect the dots with Nietzsche and Julian Jaynes. I also always appreciate when people can speak of Nietzsche without snarling, because he really is so very much vilified. And as you've mentioned, there's so much to be respected. I mean, he has so much that he has brought to the table. There's a lot of limitations, and it only gets you so far. But I think that so it's nice to see people be able to acknowledge that he may not be he may not be their cup of tea, but there's something of value that we can use for understanding other works. Because I think I've listened to other people speak, I kind of feel like Nietzsche is a good foundational read and understanding to help you understand further the other two philosophers that we've presented here today.
Wonderful. Let me ask Andy. Andy, you have done some meetups, etc. on Jung. Is that true?
Yes, that is true.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about Jung and what interests you about Jung?
Yeah. Well, I guess my central interest of Jung is this idea of individuation, the power of self-transformation through making the unconscious conscious. And I guess I became interested in that initially because I was seeking change in my life, but I didn't know any framework to realize that change. And I stumbled into Jung, and I was fascinated by what he had to say. By the whole theory of the archetypes and the unconscious, and just his particular take on, the collective nature of the unconscious, as opposed to just the merely personal kind of interpretation of the unconscious. So yeah, I mean, I just found in him an excellent thinker on just this process of self-transformation and understanding ourselves better.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. So what we did was that we actually, when we started going on Zoom about 2 years ago, we did a whole series on Jung. I'm a big fan of Jung. So we did, I think, like 40 plus meetups. The part of the series that I really liked is that we had these, I asked a whole bunch of Jungian analysts what they thought were the key ideas of Carl Jung. And we came up with like 7 or 8 ideas, which were like the heart of what Carl Jung had done. And this is, people who have spent like 20, 30 years, practicing his ideas. And then what we did was that we had these panels in the and you can find it all in the playlist that Maritza put in the chat. What we did is that we did panels on each of the concepts. So let's say concept of anima, or concept of self, or concept of individuation. And we had like 5 or 6 Jungian analysts, each of them talking about different aspects of it. So it was just an incredible way, because these people have not just read it, but they have practiced it, of saying, how does it work with individuals? And it's not just one person, but like 4 or 5 people who kind of go back and forth, and they can fill out the complexity, because Jung is very difficult to read in some ways. My strongest recommendation for Jung for anybody is I think his only work of art or fiction, which is in the part of the Red Book. Red Book is very profound, because he's trying to capture these ideas in visual forms with these mandalas and things like that. But there is this one large written piece, which is the most amazing thing. It's called The 7 Sermons to the Dead. You can listen to it on YouTube. It's like 40 minutes, and it is earth-shaking. It is earth-shaking. So we did a whole series on that as well. But there is no substitute from going and just listening to it again and again. It's just, he's trying to put all his deepest thoughts about metaphysics and about psychology in this dramatized work. So don't miss that. So that's on Jung. On Julian Jaynes, we were fortunate to have one of his students, Brian McQuay, who has written several books on Julian Jaynes, come and do about 30 meetups with us. He's writing a book on application of Julian Jaynes to psychotherapy and personal growth. So he's taken all these key concepts, and there are lectures on each of the key concepts. So for example, he has this basic idea of consciousness as an analog of reality, but then he has these other concepts of analog I, or metaphor me. And he just goes through all of those concepts. So it's a very, very easy way of accessing Jaynes. The book is brilliant. It's beautiful. I love it. I've read it many times. Also, there is this one particular chapter, which is really the heart of everything that Julian Jaynes has to say. It's chapter number 2 on consciousness. And what I do is that I like audiobooks. So I have rigged my Kindles so that it can read to me. And I was listening to this chapter over and over again so many times that I decided to just read it and put it on YouTube so I could listen to it. It's really profound. If you want a very quick summary of what Julian Jaynes has to say, it's just that chapter, and I have just read it out. So if you go to the Julian Jaynes playlist that Maritza put in, you just look for, Consciousness by Julian Jaynes, read out by me, and you can just listen to the whole thing in about an hour or so. That's really the heart of what he has to say in terms of what consciousness is. Bicameral mind, etc., is about historical development, but consciousness in the modern sense, what is it? The ones that we are using, actually. So that's on Julian Jaynes. And on Nietzsche, we had this gentleman who did such a delightful job of Nietzsche meetups. What he did was that I asked him, again, the same learning lessons from the Jungian analysts that we did. I asked him, what are the key ideas of Nietzsche? And he identified this Nietzsche. And he actually pretended to be Nietzsche in character. He didn't dress up like that, but he actually spoke as if he was Nietzsche. And he would answer people's questions with that. So that's a delightful series on Nietzsche that we have on 52 Living Ideas. And it's wonderful to have done all of this, because now we can do meetups like this, where there is a lot of familiarity with a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of new people are showing up, and hopefully we can dive into all of these folks much more than we have done before. So thank you everybody, and thank you Maritza for this just brilliant idea of doing these things together, and look forward to the next one here. What do we have coming up? I want to tell you about some really special meetups coming up here. Tomorrow, we're continuing our meetups on the Gospel of John, and we're going to the heart of the issue. We're saying it's about, really the heart of the New Testament is, who is Jesus? So the question is going to be, who is Jesus? And we're going to have a whole bunch of people trying to answer that question as best as they can. So that's going to be tomorrow. On Friday, we are doing Greek plays. And this time we're going to be doing Media by Euripides. Phil leads that. Then on Saturday, we are doing a series on Louis Sullivan. His book called A System of Architectural Design. It's not about architecture. It's not about ornamentation. It is really about creativity. So it's a very profound work. So that's on Saturday at 2 p.m. Then on Sunday, I have two meetups. At 4 o'clock, I have a very interesting meetup. Maritza, you're going to like this. I don't know whether you've heard of this, but there is an architect called Christopher Alexander, who's very good at taking inspiration from architecture throughout the world, throughout times, in order to come up with the solutions which are really kind of community solutions, which buildings or structures that work for people and interaction between people. So my friend Aaron Lewis, he actually started this project in DC. There was a big abandoned lot that was just cleared up right next to his apartment, and he and a whole bunch of neighborhood people went to the developer and say, look, this lot is going to remain empty for 3 years as you get permits. How about you let us build a garden there? So they built this huge community garden, and they have all kinds of events and all kinds of things taking place to build the community using a garden. So he's going to be talking about this entire project. He's going to take us through the garden. He's going to show us what he's done. And he's going to talk about the inspiration behind it and what his experience has been to build that, the garden community. That's going to be at 4 o'clock on Sunday. And then at 8 o'clock on Sunday, Kurt McNamara is going to be back. He's doing his book, it's a chapter from his book called Bucky for Designers. This is on Buckminster Fuller. Then Mondays we do poetry, and Tuesdays we do Confucius. And this coming Wednesdays, we're going to be we're going to have Sanjay talk about neuroscience, making the neuroscience, great research that is going on in neuroscience accessible to everybody. All right, folks, thank you so much. Thanks, Maritza. Bye, everybody. Good night.